What do you associate Armenia with? Ancient history, mountain landscapes, and a culture best known for its cuisine and cognac. But what do you know about Armenian automotive manufacturing? I'm fairly sure this is the first time you've heard about it. And yet, it did exist. Unusual, ambitious, and largely forgotten today. In this video, I'll tell its story, from its beginnings to its decline. The story begins in the 1960s, at a time when Armenia was part of the Soviet Union. During this period, the Soviet state faced a growing need for vehicles to serve trade and public services, postal deliveries, catering, repair services, and other sectors transporting small loads. The problem was simple. The USSR had virtually no proper light commercial vans. Small cargo was moved using full-size trucks such as GAZ and ZIL models. From an economic standpoint, this made little sense. Moving a few hundred kilograms often meant burning tens of liters of fuel. Even though fuel was cheap and efficiency was rarely a concern at the operational level, on a national scale, this translated into noticeable losses. At the time, the USSR effectively had only two light-duty options, the Moskvich panel van and the Bukhanka. The former was produced in limited numbers and rarely seen on the streets. The latter was primarily a military vehicle and reached civilian use only on a residual basis. It was also a full-fledged off-road vehicle, poorly suited for routine urban deliveries. The Riga Autobus factory produced minibuses, but only in passenger versions. Imports provided some relief. Vans such as the Polish Żuk and Nisa, the East German Barkas, and later Škoda models were supplied to the USSR. Still, this covered only a fraction of actual demand. By the end of the decade, it was clear that the need for a domestically produced light commercial van for civilian use had become critical. Developing a new van from scratch was quickly ruled out. It would have taken too much time and money. Instead, attention turned to the RAF 977, already in production in Latvia, which was chosen as the basis for a delivery vehicle. The passenger minibus, built on GAZ 21 Volga components, was well suited for the role. Removing the side windows and seats was enough to create a cargo space capable of carrying roughly 1 ton, exactly what was needed. By 1962, an experimental cargo version, the RAF 977, had been built on this simple concept. The vehicle was approved for service. But a new problem soon became clear. RAF itself lacked the capacity to produce these vans in the required numbers. A separate production site was needed, and that site was chosen to be Armenia. At the time, Armenia was a Soviet republic with almost no industrial base, essentially an agrarian region. At first glance, this decision seemed illogical. It would have been far easier to assign production to a major industrial plant, or place it in a region with established infrastructure, engineers, and skilled workers. Yet this choice was not accidental. There was a clear logic behind it. Soviet industrial geography was not driven by market logic. Factories were built not where it made economic sense, but where the state considered it necessary, for political, social, military, and administrative reasons. The USSR deliberately avoided concentrating industry in regions where it was already well developed. First, this helped reduce the perception of a colonial model and reinforce the idea that every republic was industrial. Second, it allowed the state to form loyal urban elites in the national republics. The logic was simple. A factory meant jobs, housing, universities, and a satisfied, loyal party leadership. This approach was especially relevant in Western Ukraine, as well as in traditionally poor and non-industrial regions of the Caucasus and Central Asia. The underlying reasoning was straightforward. An agrarian society was dependent and unstable. A working class was manageable and integrated into the system. There was also another important factor. After World War II, the Soviet leadership was deeply afraid of a repeat of 1941. As a result, industrial facilities were deliberately dispersed across the country's vast territory, as far as possible from the borders of a potential adversary. A good example is the Tashkent aircraft plant. During the war, it was evacuated from the Moscow region to Uzbekistan, and after the war, it was decided not to move it back. It later became the producer of the famous Il-76, the main transport aircraft of the Soviet Union. The same logic applied elsewhere. The Lvov bus factory, eventually became one of the largest bus producers, while the Kutaisi Automobile Plant in Georgia assembled trucks based on ZIL designs. It was within this same framework that the decision was made to establish light commercial van production in Armenia. At the time, a factory for forklift production was already under construction in Armenia. By decision of the Council of Ministers of the Armenian SSR, it was repurposed to produce delivery vans instead. The project was still at an early stage, so changing its profile required no major alterations. The new facility became known as the Yerevan Automobile Plant. The plant's workforce was trained at RAF, after which production of the RAF 977 began in Yerevan under a new designation, ErAZ 762. This is how the Riga-built vehicle received its Armenian registration, and how the Republic gained its own automotive industry. The first commercial batch of 66 vans was produced in December 1966. Within the first few years, the plant established capacity for 2,500 vehicles per year and reached an actual output of around 1,000 units annually. A subsequent reconstruction raised production first to 6,500 and later to 13,000 vehicles per year. As part of this expansion, a new 26,000 square meter building was constructed and equipped with German press machinery. In 1976, this led to the creation of the ErAZ Production Association, which included the automobile plant along with facilities producing forklifts, hydraulic equipment, and automotive components. However, there was a downside. ErAZ vans quickly developed a reputation for poor build quality and mediocre reliability. The problems became serious enough to reach the relevant ministry, but, as events would later show, they were never fully resolved. The problems were rooted not only in production culture, but in the design itself. The weaknesses of the Riga minibuses were well known: an overloaded front axle and a unibody structure with insufficient rigidity. While passenger versions were rarely pushed to their limits, cargo ErAZ vans were almost always overloaded. In essence, converting a minibus originally based on a passenger car into a delivery van was acceptable only as a temporary and forced solution. In real operation, ErAZ bodies quite literally began to crack under stress. With intensive use, service life often did not exceed 5 years, even after a major overhaul. Another issue was the plant's dependence on suppliers. ErAZ relied on body panel deliveries from Latvia and on the Gorky Automobile Plant for engines and major mechanical components. Overall, the Ministry of the Automotive Industry treated ErAZ much like other secondary manufacturers. Funding and support were allocated on a residual basis. By the late 1960s, most resources were directed toward launching the massive plant in Tolyatti. This affected not only experimental Moskvich projects, but many other factories as well. In a country of that scale, plants producing around 10,000 vehicles a year were considered insignificant. Operational experience with the ErAZ 762 made one thing clear: dependence on external suppliers had to be eliminated before any new model could be developed. Yet just as Yerevan's own press and stamping facilities reached full capacity, a directive came from above: to produce body panels for RAF vehicles instead. The flow of parts was simply reversed, now moving from Yerevan to Riga. Even so, the plant did not stand still. From the start, a group of enthusiasts had formed there, for whom automotive production in Armenia was more than a job. It was a matter of ambition and pride. Ministerial restrictions limited production and process engineers, but not the designers. For them, producing yet another Armenian RAF without windows and seats was clearly not enough. It was obvious that the existing concept had become outdated almost from the moment it entered production. A complete break with the old platform was impossible. There were no alternative engines or chassis available. But what the van needed most was a new body and a more rational layout. Importantly, this work was not obstructed at the ministerial level. On the contrary, the project involved NAMI, the country's main automotive research institute, and its expertise carried real weight. After the ErAZ 762, it became clear that even a light commercial vehicle needed a stronger foundation, a ladder frame. The unibody structure simply did not provide sufficient rigidity or mechanical strength. At first, engineers envisioned the new model in a cab-over layout. A prototype was built and tested But the results showed that the main problem remained: excessive load on the front axle. The conclusion was obvious. The vehicle had to move away from a full cab-over design toward a semi-bonnet layout. By shifting the cab back into the wheelbase, weight distribution improved and front axle load was significantly reduced. Initial road tests confirmed the decision. The ErAZ 763 showed far better balance. The first prototype was fitted with a Moskvich engine. It was cheaper and at the time seemed sufficient. However, by the next prototype, the decision was reversed and the Volga engine was brought back. The new vehicle was planned in several configurations: a minibus, ambulance, route taxi, refrigerated van, insulated cargo van, and even a motorhome-style variant. As expected, the prototypes were tested across different climatic zones of the USSR. In 1973, the vehicle successfully passed state approval and was officially recommended for mass production. And this is where the paradox begins. ErAZ became one of the first Soviet vehicles to never reach the assembly line, despite full approval at the state level. Similar cases would appear later, mostly in the late 1980s, when the Soviet economy was already in decline and funding for new models was scarce. But this case belonged to a different time, the relatively stable 1960s. The new van became a victim of the old one, which was still needed by the country. Launching the new ErAZ model would have required abandoning production of the previous version. The plant simply had no capacity for parallel manufacturing, nor was any expansion planned. The two vehicles were based on different platforms and shared almost nothing beyond the engine. This meant a complete reconfiguration of the assembly line, replacement of body production, and modernization of the press shop, all of which required substantial investment. Unlike other Soviet automotive plants, ErAZ could not rely on export prospects to justify a new model. Its modest output, around 10,000 vans per year, was easily absorbed by the domestic market. The situation was further complicated by the fact that ErAZ supplied body panels for RAF vehicles, which were still in full production in 1973. The new RAF model appeared only in 1976, meaning a changeover in Yerevan would have affected the Riga plant as well. This was a kind of internal automotive geopolitics, shaped by the realities of a planned economy. As a result, the new model became stuck between successful state approval and actual mass production. From time to time, small batches of the vans were assembled, often used to promote a vehicle that, by then, was no longer truly new. Still, the angular body design proved successful and looked almost timeless. The model was also used during the 1980 Moscow Olympics, where 10 specially prepared ErAZ 3702 refrigerated vans were put into service. The vehicle continued to appear at exhibitions, including Avtoprom 85, where it received a bronze medal, and later in Poland, where an insulated version was shown in Poznan. By the mid-1980s, production of the older ErAZ models had grown to 15,000 vehicles per year, while the ErAZ 3730 never made it to the assembly line. At the same time, the prosperous period for the Soviet automotive industry and for the country as a whole had already effectively come to an end, even if few realized it at the time. After the collapse of the USSR, Armenia found itself in a difficult position. Launching a new model into full-scale production was simply not an option. The factory's priority was survival, and production of the old ErAZ continued as long as possible. Only in the mid-1990s, after the ErAZ 762 was finally phased out, did serial production of the ErAZ 3730 begin. This happened in 1995. 22 years after the model had received a positive recommendation from the State Commission. Even then, its assembly line life was short. Production lasted only until the early 2000s, ending in 2002 when ErAZ went bankrupt. In its final years, output was limited to small, almost hand-built batches. The reason this promising vehicle never became truly mass-produced was, in fact, quite simple. Light commercial vans were never considered a strategic product and were funded on a residual basis. The existing model largely covered demand. Imports from friendly countries filled the gaps, and domestic trucks continued to handle both large and small loads. Under these conditions, launching an entirely new van, requiring a full production overhaul, for just 10,000 to 15,000 units per year, and without export prospects, made little economic sense. Prosaic as it may sound, this is how the enthusiasm of engineers ultimately collided with the practicality of a planned economy.